The topic is actually the LaRouche program to solve the breakdown crisis. The entire panel is what Dennis just said. And over the course of the various presentations and the discussions which you hear today, we hope to cover that territory. The fact of the matter is that we are now in the thick of the breakdown crisis. The crisis has indeed struck. Just a minute. What am I hearing? We're getting broadcast, I think, probably from the Spanish translation, if I'm not mistaken. I appreciate that very much, however. I don't really need it. So the crisis has struck. The crisis is, in fact, upon us. Exactly as LaRouche has warned would be the case. In 2008, when the bubble burst, it was so-called solved in the exact worst way imaginable. What happened is that massive amounts of bailout money of so-called quantitative easing were issued, which led to a hyperinflationary blowout, which has made things simply worse. And if you take a look at the first slide, which we have queued up here, you'll get an idea of what I'm referring to.
Yeah, but that would not pack it down.
Now, this you may have seen things similar to this in our earlier presentations, but what you have here is the fact that the total amount of quantitative easing, let me explain what that technical term means. It means funny money. It means monopoly money. It's just plain monopoly money with no backing whatsoever. Since 2008, on principally Barack Obama's watch, there has been a total of about $4.5 to $5.5 trillion in funny money issued between the United States, the ECB, and the United Kingdom Bank of England. Against that, supposedly the purpose of this was, of course, to give the banks some money so that they could be so kind as to lend to us and so on. And, of course, they got all of this money, and did they lend? No, of course they didn't lend. What actually happened is that total bank lending dropped by $1 trillion over this period. But this is only a small reflection of the problem. This is really not the gist of it. This is just one small piece, because what you had was a massive bailout, way beyond this $5 trillion or so in quantitative easing. And what you had was a total collapse of the physical economy in all parts of the world, in some places worse than others, but nonetheless, the entire physical economy has been imploding over the last 5 years. And that has brought us to the situation that we're facing today. I'll give you an example. With what happened just now in Crete, in that situation, and then in Cyprus, what you have was, with the seizure of the bank accounts around the Cyprus situation, in Spain, there are economists who are saying that right now we're all going to face the same thing. They're going to seize our bank accounts too. And you know what? It's okay. It's the way it goes. We simply have to accept that that is what is actually going to occur. And this very prominent Spanish economist said, what we have to do is realize that out of the 23 million people in the labor force of Spain, there's no jobs for 5 or 6 million of them, as there is unemployment now for that many people. And what we have to do, he said, is we have to throw them out of the country. Just expel them. After all, they're foreigners, most of them. So if this smells a little bit like first the gypsies, then the Jews, and then everybody else, you're right. That's exactly what this is. This is Nazi economics, and that is the alternative that is being posed and that we're facing us today. Now, what is behind this? What you have to ask yourself, if you want to know what the enemy is going to do, know thy enemy. If you want to know what he's going to do, look at his intention. Intentions are actually critical. And if you take a look at the next slide, I think you have a very good summary of what the intention of the British Empire is. This is Bertrand Russell in 1951. You heard a bit about him. He was the guy, he's the nice guy, as Jeff mentioned, who wanted to blow the Soviet Union into smithereens with nuclear weapons before they had one themselves. After that, he became a little bit different in his tenor. But Bertrand Russell is a straight genocidalist, and there's a reason that Lyndon LaRouche called him the most evil man of the 20th century. And he would have been of the 21st had he lived that long. What he said, and this is just one of his quotes, war has hitherto been disappointing in this respect of population control, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove effective. If a Black Death could spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. Now, this is the policy of the British Empire today of reducing the world population from 7 billion people down to 1 billion. And they're very explicit about this. So it's very important to know what the intentions are of your enemy. And in fact, I think it's safe to say that actually the road to hell is paved with bad intentions. Now, what are we going to do about this? Let's take this actually from the top. Next slide, please. Usually, people are fairly familiar, I believe, with the LaRouche's program, the three-point program, Glass-Steagall, a credit system, a Hamiltonian credit system, and great development projects like NWAPA, like asteroid defense, like the common aims of mankind. But I want to go at it the other way around. I want to take it from the top down. So this is as top as I could get with a quick search for some pictures on the internet. And I cannot vouch for the truth of that statement, that you're actually there. I also want to assure you that this was not taken by Google Earth. They're not up there yet. They're not up to the task. Now, we have to get outside the here and now. We've got to look at this from a standpoint of simultaneously looking at this, not just from here, from the local planet, as Ben was discussing earlier. We have to think of this from the standpoint minimally of our solar system, and in fact, of our galaxy and the entire universe. And we have to look at this not simply in terms of the immediate here and now of this situation today in this hour. We've got to think towards the future, and because the future is actually here now and will happen unless we change the course of events. Now, the problems that we're facing, I've been told by reliable sources that the sun is more than likely going to explode sometime in the next 2 billion years. Now, that may seem like it's fairly far away. It will, however, pose a pretty big problem to us. But even more quickly than that, as the next slide indicates, what we're looking at are very serious dangers to the existence of the entire species. This is an asteroid's eye view of the planet Earth. And we've been discussing today the kinds of dangers that the existence of the species faces if we don't get beyond the boundaries of the here and now and look at things from the standpoint of actually changing and affecting the future and the far reaches of our solar system, the galaxy, and the universe. Now, even sooner than, possibly sooner than an asteroid impact, is the danger of thermonuclear war, which is a very real danger, an immediate danger, if we do not get humanity on the course of jointly organizing around the common aims of mankind. That is something that could happen in the very short term. And what's going to be required to solve all of these problems, starting with the disappearance of our sun, to the possibility of an asteroid impact, to the danger of nuclear war, to the very great danger of the entire world financial system disintegrating, as is now occurring, all of which threaten the human species in different ways. What we are going to have to do is to think differently. We have to think differently to come up with solutions to these problems. We have to figure out not what our senses detect around us, but we have to think what the intention of the universe is. What are the principles that are guiding the development of the universe? And for anyone who doubts the concept that the universe actually has intentions, or there is an intentionality given to the universe in terms of its development, I simply ask you to contemplate the fact that man is part of the universe. In fact, we're a highly functional part of the universe if we choose to not be jerks. And that man is endowed with free will, which is to say the same thing as creativity. That has been demonstrated empirically, not in an empiricist way, but empirically over the course of human development of our species. And it demonstrates, in fact, that since we are characterized by that capacity for creativity, thus free will, thus intentions do matter, good and bad, that the universe as a whole, of necessity, if we're part of it, which we are, is characterized by those same principles. So we have to figure this one out. And we have to figure it out fast and operate on that basis. That's what I mean by taking this problem from the top, the economic problem. The question is, man's ability to detect, to know, and to change the intention of the universe depends on the development of the productive powers of labor. What I mean by the productive powers of labor is this: the ability to think, creativity. That's labor. It's activity which changes the physical universe, and there is nothing more powerful as a force, as a material force in the physical universe than creative ideas. Now, that increase of the productive powers of labor is in fact the source of wealth. That's where actual wealth comes from. Not money, for sure, not these days, and you don't have to have a bank account in Cyprus to know that, although it's certainly proven there. But that's not the source of wealth. The source of wealth is man's unending, continuous capability, not guaranteed, capability of actually coming up with new solutions and new ways of addressing problems. So in one sense, what we're really talking about here that I would pose as the real challenge facing mankind is that we have to establish something that I would call the strategic defense of mind, because it is that which is most dearly threatened and which is the most crucial thing to be defended. Now, with that approach and outlook, that intention in mind, let's take a look at the planet, starting from the top, from the outside. Let's take a look at the population of the planet, the most precious resource that we have. If it is in fact the case that the development of the productive powers of labor is the source of wealth, of real wealth in an economy, how are we doing? All right? As the former mayor of New York City, Ed Koch, used to say, "How am I doing? How am I doing?" Some people will remember that. How are we doing? Where do we stand? Well, take a look at the next slide. This comes from plain old World Bank data, most of which I take to be false. So what I'm showing you are proportions only, and they're probably off to some degree, but it gives you the idea here. The stupidest thing we could possibly do as a human species is to take that which is most precious and is the source of wealth and either make people incapable of exercising that capability by making them so poor they can't think, so poor they're hungry all the time, or the other thing that's quite effective if you want to achieve that result is to just make sure they don't work, unemploy them. Now, what we have here is the fact that 2.7 billion human beings out of a total world population of about 7 billion currently live in poverty. Poverty, according to the wisdom of the World Bank, is defined as an income of less than $2 a day. Now, again, forget the units and the measurement. Just think about the idea here. Poverty. 38% of the human race is poor, and of that 38%, more than half, which is to say 20%, are extremely poor, live in extreme poverty. That's sometimes classified as food hunger, which I gather does not require any further explanation from me. They quantify it as less than $1.25 a day in income. So that's pretty stupid if we're allowing this to happen to the human race. Now let's look at the question of employment and unemployment in the next slide. This is LaRouche's bar diagram, which many of you may be familiar with. It's reorganized a little bit to make the point. There's a certain amount of information on here just to give the idea, but the important thing to look at is, first of all, 15% of the entire world's population is unemployed. Now, since their figures say that about half of the population is part of the labor force, which I would dispute, but nonetheless, let's take them at their word on that. You're talking about a global unemployment rate of approximately 30%. A third of the workforce of the world isn't working. Pretty stupid, or pretty genocidal, depending on who's causing it and what their intention is. Then, if you take a look at the areas of economic activity, even those who are working, the areas of economic activity which produce changes in the productive powers of labor, which increase our ability to know, master, and make advance the physical universe around us. Industry, manufacturing, science, technology, where do we stand? How are we doing? Not so good. 7% of the world's population, 14% perhaps of the labor force, are involved in industry. And that's very loosely defined. Believe me, that's not all actually productive. It's their category, though. And of that, 1% are engaged in R&D. Maybe 2% of the labor force worldwide, with a significant component of that, obviously, in the United States, Japan, Germany. Even with the collapse going on here, the rest of the world is nowhere on this thing. This is about as stupid as you can get if you sit down and you say, okay, I'm part of the human race. Where do we stand? It couldn't have been done worse had it been done intentionally, which it was. Now, let's be very specific. How stupid is it to unemploy your population? Take a look at the next slide. This is the situation in Spain. Spain, which is following close behind on the heels of Greece, tumbling over the edge of the cliff into fascism, fascist economics. Over the course of the last 8 years, the total unemployment in Spain has risen from about 9% to 26%, and youth unemployment in Spain is now 55%, just behind Greece at 62%. Now, you tell me, what does it mean for a society, for a nation, for the world, for morality, if 60% of your youth have no job? What does that mean? It means there's no future. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. There is no difference between this and Hitler's concentration camps. There is no systematic distinction. There's a distinction of degree, but it's also coming from the same intention, the same British intention behind those concentration camps. Now, what are we going to do? Well, again, let's take this from the top. Our intention, as opposed to their intention, is to increase and improve the proportions of the labor force that are dedicated to those areas of activities which actually produce wealth. Wealth not defined in money terms, not even defined in terms of physical output, but produces wealth which is an increase in the productive powers of labor. How do we take that horrible bar diagram that I showed you before, those terrible proportions, and change them so that more people, for starters, eat, more people work, more people produce things that are productive, more people are involved in science and classical culture and so forth? How do we do that? Well, next slide. Again, let's take it from the top. This is, pardon the Spanish, that's the only version I could find that I had handy for this. This is a polar view of Lynn and Helga LaRouche's proposal for the World Land Bridge. And it identifies, you could call this the asteroid's eye view of things, but this is the human eye view. This is the way human beings need to think. Let's take a look at the whole planet. Okay, what are we going to do? Now, in the next slide, you see this in a slightly more familiar presentation, which is the World Land Bridge showing in red what does not yet exist but which must be built, and in green the rail lines that do exist. And this is superimposed on something which I find quite useful to think about, the world's great deserts. Because the entire planet has to be terraformed. In other words, we have to improve the functioning of the biosphere, of which we are not only a part, but the highest expression, as the noosphere. And we have to improve this by our economic activity to increase the productive powers of labor. Well, what should we do? All right, here's some ideas. Why don't we build a tunnel under the Bering Strait? And let's build rail links that actually link together in productive corridors, 100 kilometers on each side, high-speed rail lines, maglev if possible, wherever possible, moving towards that where not yet quite feasible, and that we establish energy-intense forms of industry all along these rail lines, move into the next stages of nuclear energy development, and that we use these kinds of massive infrastructural projects to get everyone back to work and to get them back to work producing productive things, and especially those things that lead towards an increase in the productive powers of labor, i.e. idea-intense activity. We have to increase the idea flux density of our economic activity. Now, not just the Bering Strait Tunnel, which is up in the north there, which you probably are familiar with. That's where Sarah Palin sits, looking over a couple of kilometers towards Russia, so long as she's pointed in the right direction, which is by no means guaranteed. But other major projects, just look at the world. Take it from the top. What else needs to be done? Well, I'll identify 3 other major projects. We need to have a rail link built through the Darien Gap. That's in Panama and Colombia, to link in all of South America with North America. There is no passage there of any sort now, except if you're a drug runner, in which case you've got plenty of passage. But there's no rail, there's no roads, there's no nothing. We need another sea level canal connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific. where the current Panama Canal exists, and we have to build high-speed rails through there. It's a bottleneck that will allow the integration and development of those regions. Then, extremely important, Gibraltar. The passage from Spain into Africa, it's one of the crucial links to bring the land bridge into Africa and to begin the process of salvaging probably the most benighted continent on the planet at this point. Also, an ambitious project needs to be done. And then the third one, which I'll only mention because Michael will be talking to you about this somewhat, is the crucial NAWAPA project for the United States, Canada, and Mexico, which affects that area there, number 5, the Great American Desert. These are the kinds of things that need to be done, which will require the development of all sorts of ancillary industries. It will increase the technologies in terms of their energy flux density. You've heard that expression mentioned a couple of times today. It simply means the power that can be wielded by an individual human mind to transform the universe surrounding us. Not how much bang do you get for your buck, but rather how much power do your ideas have to transform the universe around us. And therefore, successful human development requires increasing energy flux density, which in turn requires having some technologies that make some sense, like nuclear energy, as opposed to the insanity that the greenies enjoyed talking about, which is solar and wind and so on and so forth. I mean, that is so stupid and so unscientific and so genocidal that it's almost as bad as if someone had intentionally meant to kill people off, which they did. Now, in all of this, of course, we need to, and we will, change the proportions of the labor force in terms of this activity. And the next slide shows you again what I showed you first, and then the next one shows you the transformation which we're going to undertake. Again, there's a lot of material on this. I know you won't be able to, maybe you won't even be able to see it, but it's a lot to digest. But I want to point to 3 things. We will be, in 25 years, one generation, by the year 2040, the world population will increase to 11 billion. It will not drop to 1 billion people. It will increase to 11 billion. Like it or not, Bertrand Russell, and Parson Malthus, and Prince Philip, and what's his name? Barack Obama? So 11 billion people. But more important than just an increase in the population, what are the proportions of activity, of labor force activity, of our species, yours and mine, it's our species, to bring about a potential for increased growth of the productive powers of labor? Well, first and foremost, this idea of people being unemployed is just completely ridiculous. And we will be able to, within a generation's time, reduce unemployment to perhaps 2% of the labor force, so 1% of the population. That's one important result. Industry, we will be able to increase very significantly, probably to 20% of the total population, perhaps 40% of the labor force, more rapidly in some areas than others. It's going to take a little work in areas that are further behind to qualify people. It doesn't happen by saying, be it done. It happens by educating people, training people, mobilizing politically, and so on. And then the R&D, or the research side, the investigation, the science side, of necessity moves even slower. But nonetheless, we will be able to bring these proportions up, according to very rough calculations that we've done, to about 5% of the total population within a generation's time. That's not enough. That's not nearly enough, because it is that activity, that and classical culture, scientific and classical cultural activity, which makes us what we are, human beings, our species. And that has to improve significantly, but that's not going to happen in only 25 years. But we'll be on the right road on this thing. Now, within all of this, the United States plays a very special role. I mean, the idea here is not to take the entire world's population and sort of distribute the wealth equitably. You will not get the most rapid rate of growth of the productive powers of labor of the species if you do that. And the United States has a very special role, historically, politically, economically, as taking responsibility, not just for our country, but for the entire world in the proper way. And that very special role of the United States is something that, again, will be discussed further in the course of this panel. What it has to do with is setting up a financial arrangement to make all of this work. So everything I've said so far is actually speaks to point 3 of LaRouche's 3-point program. I've taken it backwards, as you've noticed, because the rest is a piece of cake. If you get this right, if your intention is to do this, if you understand what it is about the power of ideas, and we get people thinking in terms of those creative ideas, the rest falls right into place. What sort of a financial system? Well, it's obvious. You need a credit system along a Hamiltonian basis, which will do a couple of things. It'll make sure that the necessary amount of credit goes to the proper areas quickly enough for sufficient periods of time. And in particular, it'll allow us to measure in the economy in a way that makes sense. In other words, what sort of a financial instrument or what sort of money is going to function 25 years down the line? Certainly not one pegged to the derivatives market. It's going to have to be a credit system. But if you have your intentions straight, that falls into place. It really is not that complicated. Now, and it should make clear as well that the worst possible way to measure an economy is in terms of monetary values. Money has no value in and of itself, and you do not have to be a Cypriot to learn that. Learn it before becoming a Cypriot, or you may end up regretting it. So a dollar is not a dollar, a dollar is a dollar. It doesn't work that way. It works in a totally different way in terms of the productive powers of labor. So if that's the kind of credit system that we need to create in order to be able to do what is really the most important thing, ideas followed by physical economy, that in turn dictates what the credit system has to be. And that rapidly brings us to our third and final point, which is, what do we do about the fact that right now, under the current state of affairs, all of the financial instruments are being channeled into the speculative bubble, into the cancer, and not into productive activity? I mean, you couldn't have done it this badly if you intended to. Now, I've often thought that we need to define a new discipline. You know, you've heard about economics and econometrics and all of these things that you get terminal degrees in if you're foolish enough to study economics at a university. But really, given that what is studied today and what's going on is really a financial cancer and nothing but, and cancers are studied by oncologists, I really think we need a new discipline called onconomics. Because, I mean, what would you say if you, as a patient with cancer, went to an oncologist and he said, no problem, you're doing great. We're just going to make sure that everything goes to feed that cancer and nothing at all for that other healthy tissue stuff here. I mean, you owe it to your cancer. You signed a piece of paper that said you would respect that cancer. I've got a piece of paper here. I have an instrument. Yeah, I bet on it a little bit, but, you know, that's what derivatives are. Those are the laws of the market. What would you say about that kind of oncologist, assuming you didn't strangle him in the first minute and a half of your meeting? You would send him where he belongs, which is to rehabilitation in a local facility, either psychiatric or criminal, depending on his outlook. This doesn't work. This clearly doesn't work. The favoring of the cancer has to stop. And what we have to do, the reason for Glass-Steagall, it's really very simple. If your intention is ideas, and if from that idea flows the intention of the productive economy, and from that flows the need for a credit system, it's obvious you need Glass-Steagall to simply say to the cancer, sorry, you know what? It's all over. It's done. No more money for the cancer, period. And what will be done is that the resources that are available will be channeled, according to a credit system, into productive activity. The cancers that held shares in a bank, sorry, the ride's over. More important that the population and the species survive than you handful of criminal bankers. And the game is over on this thing. And this is, of course, exactly what Glass-Steagall says. I mean, first of all, you know, take all the other reports. Take the Dodd-Frank report, and if you have a shortage of Charmin in your supermarket, you can use the Dodd-Frank report. It'll last a long time. It's long. So, I mean, you know, even if you have an upset stomach, that'll work. And you can take the Buchanan proposal, you can take ring fencing, you can take electrified ring fencing, although I would not use that for your toilet paper. But it's all useless. Take the Glass-Steagall bill, all 36 pages of it, depends on the size of the print. And what's most interesting to my mind about the Glass-Steagall bill is that it has, as does our Constitution, a preamble. Now, the preamble of the Constitution states the intention. What is the intent of everything that follows? So does the Glass-Steagall bill. And the opening, next slide please, of the Glass-Steagall bill says the following. These are the very first words, the first sentence. It says, an act to provide for the safer and more effective use of the assets of banks, to regulate interbank control, to prevent the undue diversion of funds into speculative operations and for other purposes. Well, that's reasonable. Let's prevent the undue diversion of funds into speculative operations. It's obvious, straightforward, and it all flows exactly from that. So the way we're going to win this fight is not by providing people with information or information alone. They need information. You have to win people over to a totally different concept of man. You have to get them to understand that sense certainty will take them to perdition. Remember, the road to hell is paved with sense certainty. It's a bad intention. Don't do it. Reject the idea of money as holding any value, which it does not, and join with other forces in this country and elsewhere to get this thing implemented starting immediately. People need to change the way they think, and we all have to do that starting with our own minds. Done that, I'm fairly confident that the rest will be as music to our ears. Thank you.